Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is, and welcome. I'm Larry Erickson. This is the Erickson Report. And we are back after a hiatus, and we're going to start right back with something I like to start with whenever I can. A little bit of good news about some things. First off is at the end of last month, YouTube responded to the waves of misinformation and outright lies about COVID and the related vaccines. But in doing so, it went beyond what you might have expected from some corporate giant with its eyes on the bottom line. Specifically, on September 29th, the company issued a statement saying, quoting, "Content that falsely alleges that approved vaccines are dangerous and cause chronic health effects, claims that the vaccines do not reduce transmission or contraction of disease, or contains misinformation on the substances contained in vaccines will be removed." The point here is that this rule does not only apply to the COVID BS, it applies to all anti-vax BS. Now, there are, of course, exceptions and loopholes, so it's going to depend on how seriously the platform wants to enforce the rule. But still, credit where it's due for going beyond where I, for one, had any expectation they would. All right, next up, this one, I suppose, is just here because, for me, it's a feel-good story. On October 1st, Texas District Court Judge Maya Guerra Gamble issued default judgments against conspiracy wacko and all-around Dumbo Alex Jones, citing his long track record of bad faith in dealing with lawsuits by parents of two children who were killed in the 2012 mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School. Jones had claimed the shooting was a hoax and a false flag operation, and that parents were lying about mourning their children. What this really means is that it's no longer a question of if he will be held responsible for the defamation and emotional pain he inflicted on them with their lies, but only one of, in the words of Bill Ogden, a lawyer for the parents, how big a check it will be. Now, this ruling is subject to appeal, and doubtless one will come, but Jones is running out of dodges. He has been run to the ground, and I just feel that's a feel-good story. All right, for the rest of the show, we are going to plunge in, taking a longer look at where we are now. Because I expect we all know that we are facing threats to our very survival as a republic. Threats marked by restrictions on voting plus gerrymandering, which together create the real potential for a permanent entrenched minority rule on behalf of an economic and social elite, as well as the less well-noticed but equally threatening restrictions on the right to public protest. This occurring even as we are aswarm with useful idiots ignoring the real threats and being distracted into wallowing in paranoia and conspiracy theories, which has been demonstrated most recently by mob rule at school board meetings. Now, this degree of threat to our continuing functioning as a free republic is serious. Indeed, it appears to be greater at any time than in generations, if not longer. But it's not new. Every free society is at constant risk at having those freedoms lost through some combination of usurpation by the few and indifference among the many. What we face now, we have in varying degrees and at varying times faced before. Nearly 60 years ago, in November of 1964, noted American historian Richard Hofstadter described what he called the paranoid style in American politics, citing examples from the 1790s right up through McCarthyism and the right-wing seizure of the Republican Party and the candidacy of Barry Goldwater that it produced. Now, without going into the history of the various movements and upheavals he mentioned, what's a particular note here is the common threads that he found running through all of them. Adherents either believed that they were holding off threats to what they held dear, what Hofstadter called the causes and personal types that were the established way of life, or that they had to reclaim, to claw back those causes and types, claw back an established way of life that was already being lost. And always, 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 there were conspiracies among powerful, evil, hidden forces to undermine, to destroy that way of life. Now think of that description, and you think that Hofstadter was writing in 2021, not 57 years earlier. What we're seeing now has been a consistent thread in American history. Although it's important to note that despite that caveat, it still does appear that the degree of internal risk we now face is greater than at any time, perhaps since the Civil War. But what I actually want to talk about here, I actually want to spend our time on here, is that part of our problem, something that adds to that risk, is that significant parts of the liberal and progressive left fail to understand or at least address the underlying nature, the roots of that risk, arguing instead that it's just that the Goppers are irredeemably racist and it all started with the election of Barack Obama breaking open the dams of racism, or that it came from the rise of Tweety Pie, or the more sophisticated version that Tweety Pie merely allowed for, justified the existence of that racism. Now, but all that is true. The point is the roots of our current crisis date before 2016. They date before 2008. In fact, we should look back about 45 years to the mid-1970s. Now, to see why, jump back a bit further to the political and social climate surrounding the social changes of the 1960s. The Indochina-Vietnam War was every bit as divisive as what we are seeing now. The social conflict was, to be blunt, every bit as great. It literally shattered not just friendships, but families. Even beyond that, this was a time of dramatic social upheaval. The civil rights movement that started in the 1950s continued throughout the 1960s. The Port Huron Statement, and if you don't know what that is, look it up. In fact, you might want to read it. It's kind of long, but you might find it interesting. The Port Huron Statement came in 1962. The Feminine Mystique was published in 1963. The first women's liberation organizations were founded in 1966 and 1967. The Stonewall Uprising was in 1969. The first Earth Day, this is long before it evolved into a corporate and government-sponsored pay into picking up litter, the first Earth Day was in 1970. And all this happened amid the counterculture, talk of violent revolution, 3 assassinations, riots, and in fact the events in places like Newark and Detroit in 1967 made the so-called riots of the Black Lives Matter protests look like tea parties by comparison. And all this occurring at the same time that there were actually widespread demands that all dissent be violently repressed. The thing is, though, that even through that decade, even through all that upheaval, I don't recall there ever being a pervading sense that our society was disintegrating, that it was irreparably fracturing. And the fact is we got through it, not only in spite of, but in fact because of the protests and upheavals. And a decade later, polls said that a majority of Americans said that we were better as a people for having gone through all that. So what's different this time? I mean, why do the stresses now seem so much bigger, the threats so much larger? This is where the left's failure to understand comes in, which I will show with 3 charts and 1 headline. All right, first the charts, the graphs. This one is from a study of Census Bureau reports, which shows real, that is, after allowing for inflation, it means it's a measure of how much stuff you can actually buy. Real household income at varying income levels over a 45-year period from 1965 to 2012. I want you to notice the third one from the bottom, that sort of gold-colored one. That marks the 50th percentile, the median income. That is the point at which there were as many families earning above that level as there were families earning below that level. Note that it is essentially, that median income is essentially unchanged over those 45 years. The rich got richer, pulling away, and the more richer you were, the more away you pulled. But half of American households gained pretty much nothing. Zoom in a bit and come a little closer in time with this one. This comes from Pew Research. It covers 1964 to 2018. While average hourly wages for American workers are 9 times what they were in 1964, purchasing power has gone up just a bit over 10% in that time. And in fact, if you look a bit closer, you'll find that purchasing power is actually below where it was in the 1970s. 50 years of work, and the average wage earner is worse off than they were then. And finally, this one from the Federal Reserve, showing how much of total wealth is held by the top 1% as opposed to the middle class, defined here as the middle 60% of income. That is, ignoring the poorest 20% and the richest 20%. As recently as 1989, that middle class held double the wealth that the 1% did, 36.4 to 17.2%. But this year, 2021, for the first time, that changed. The rich now hold 27% of the nation's wealth, to the middle class is 26.6. The top 20% of earners as a group now hold 70% of the total wealth of the nation, up 10 percentage points since 1990. Together, these illustrate one real difference between now and the 1960s. Then, even as events and changes, whether welcomed or disturbing, swirled around you, you mostly had a sense of security, of economic security in your own personal life. The economic status of the middle class had been growing and looked like it would continue to grow, and people felt they could look forward to a secure retirement and the prospect that, and what I maintain is the real American dream, your kids would be better off than you were. This provided a foundation, a stability that made coping with the social changes around you that much easier. Now, yes, of course, there were recessions and dips, but overall, that growth was real. And yes, of course, it was much less true of blacks and other minorities and of the poor in general, but it was true of that broad middle class. And to the same extent that that middle class was mostly populated by whites, to that same extent, it was a genesis of another root of our current crisis, one which I'll get to in a couple of minutes. The point here is that that sense of economic security no longer exists. It's something that has been developing for decades, as real median family income in the United States has gone nowhere over those past decades, despite the growth of two-income families and a slightly longer average work week. That is, people are working harder and longer and getting nowhere for it. And while people likely didn't know the facts and figures of that trend, they did know the feel of it, the sense of it, the day-to-day lived reality of it, the sense that things were just not right, that things were not turning out the way that they had come to expect, not only for themselves, but more importantly for their children. Around 1995, that loss of economic security had created what was then called the angry white male. And this is someone I actually looked at the time with some sympathy. This angry white male, I wrote at the time, is, and I'm quoting, not without legitimate grievances. His hopes are shrinking, his dreams for his family and his children are fading. He keeps working harder and getting less for it. The result is that he feels pressured, frustrated, haunted by the suspicion that he's failed his family, that his efforts are underappreciated, which combine to make him bitter and defensive, ready, even eager to find someone to blame to relieve his own guilt and creeping despair. Makes him an easy mark for a hot 30-second ad in a political campaign saying, "You didn't do anything wrong, they did it to you." In 2010, it was the Tea Party. And again, I took what I called at the time a not altogether unsympathetic look at the teabaggers, saying they were not without real grievances and not without genuine frustrations. But again, just like before, they were aiming their anger at the wrong target. Quoting myself, "These people have been misguided, misled, lied to, manipulated. They are directing their frustrations at the weak, not the strong, at the victims, not the victimizers, at the servants of the powerful in and out of government, not at the powerful themselves, mostly not in government. For all of the noise, all of the shouting, all of the energy, all of the speeches, signs, slogans, the fact is they, for the most part, really have no idea what's going on, what the real causes of their stresses are. They just know they want things the way they used to be." Because when people are under stress, they become, in the social and psychological, rather than the political sense of the term here, conservative. They become cautious, less willing to risk, less able to deal with change, more concerned with holding on to what they still have. Recall when Barack Obama was attacked for referring to people in Western Pennsylvania as clinging to their guns and their religion. Now, the point was clumsily expressed. It deserved more of an explanation, but it's entirely valid. The people in that area were suffering real economic dislocations. Jobs were disappearing, and the stable communities on which those people had depended for generations were, more importantly, disappearing along with them. So of course they clung to their guns and their religion. When you are under pressure, constantly stressed, when the things you have counted on seem to be slipping away, you are going to cling ever more tightly to those you have left. Those parts of your world that still make sense, that you can still control. This is a normal, natural, entirely human response. Some years ago, someone, unfortunately I don't recall who, noted how times of social change can be difficult for those living through them, but people adjust, they move on, and a generation or two later, people don't understand what all the fuss was about. But when there is a constant undercurrent of emotional, of psychological stress rooted in a lack of stability, a lack of economic stability, a lack of economic security, it's that much harder to deal with other issues, and that difficulty can be and has been exploited by the very people most responsible for that constricted future. That sense, that it's the corporate elite. It's the rich, the powerful, those who selfishly gain from the economic trends, those who benefit the most from all the old oppressions and divisions, the people who are doing their damnedest to get fingers pointed at anyone except them. That is where the anger should be directed, and that's where it wasn't. The bottom line here, the thing I want to point out, the thing I want to get to, is that too much of the liberal and progressive left either fails to understand or at least address the fact that we cannot address the social dangers we face to our future as a free people without addressing the economy, and not in a vacuum, not as a separate issue, but as an integral part of achieving the ends we seek. An economy for the 99%, to recall the Occupy movement 10 years down the road, an economy for the 99%, which means including the legitimate economic concerns, appreciating the economic stress of that white middle class, which we too often dismiss as unworthy of our attention. And we will get to the rest after a break. And we are back. All right, getting back to our longer look. Before I move to the other way, the left has failed to grasp the roots of the threat to our future. I want to mention briefly, because it has been discussed by others, that another part of why that threat is greater now than at other times is the facility with which the lies can be spread, the opportunities for manipulation that exist. Not only in the technological changes, such as things like the founding of Fox News or Facebook algorithms pushing users to ever more paranoid content, but the simple fact that the right wing has over time become more adept at exploiting the stresses, at directing where fingers get pointed. Recall that during the time of the angry white male, it was a hot 30-second ad during a political campaign. By the time of the Tea Party, it was staged chaos at public meetings of public officials. Now it's graduated to staged chaos at school board meetings. Give the devil his due, the puppet masters of the right have upped their game over time. Okay. The other thing that the left has failed to appreciate can be summed up in this headline from Associated Press. U.S. is diversifying, white population shrinking. The Census Bureau predicts that within 25 years, the U.S. will become a majority-minority nation. That is, one where no ethnic or racial group makes up a majority of the total population. In fact, that is already true for the U.S. for those under 18. Now, yes, this has often been discussed in lefty discussions, but it's usually in an in-your-face right-wing style, under the notion that this heralds an increasingly liberal, progressive, populist, and electorate. Now, that may prove to be true. U.S. minorities have historically voted more liberal than whites have, but other lefties, such as me, are less convinced that this will usher into a new, dramatically progressive era, wondering if, as they become more established, these other communities will continue to vote the way they have in the past. But in any event, folks like me will still look at that headline and react to it as, that's an interesting demographic fact. It promises a multi-ethnic, multiracial, and therefore rather more interesting America. But conservative and even moderate whites can look at that headline and find it threatening. It's been demonstrated often enough by both psychological testing and historical analysis that the one common factor that unites all of those who call themselves politically conservative, crossing all lines of age, sex, race, nationality, income level, gender, all of it, the common factor is fear of change. Conservatism, bluntly, is based on fear. And I don't mean fear-mongering as a political tactic here. I mean an internal fear, a personal fear, a fear that the world around you is no longer comprehensible. And the more change there is, the more rapid the change, the more that conservatism grows. If the world of society around you is changing in ways you can't seem to understand, that don't fit your personal worldview, you can become disoriented and frightened. And that fear, the fear of the changes, will make you more conservative. And that sort of disorientation is exactly what a significant percentage of white Americans are facing now. One of the things that struck me about the Tea Partiers, and strikes me again now, is that there was an overwhelming, an extreme sense of what can only be called privilege in the entire undertaking. Privilege entitlement is maybe even a better word in the undertaking. Tea Party proponents said over and over, it's our country, and they were going to take it back. They insisted that government failure to do whatever they wanted was ignoring the will of the people. Their progeny today echo all that with their delusions about election fraud and their loud shouts about their freedom when it comes to matters of public health. That notion of entitlement was demonstrated in the results of a New York Times CBS survey that was done in April 2010, which included the question, do the views of the people involved in the Tea Party movement generally reflect the views of most Americans? Some 25% of all respondents said yes. But 84% of those involved in the Tea Party themselves said yes. Overwhelmingly, they were convinced that they did represent the people, that they were the people, despite the fact that that same survey showed that the views of the Tea Partiers to be clearly, sometimes stunningly, to the right of the general public. All right, with that in mind, consider the demographics that of the teabaggers that were revealed by that survey, which I would be more than happy to bet are essentially the same demographics as what we're seeing now. On the whole, they were white, male, older, somewhat richer, and somewhat more educated than the general populace. Which means that until fairly recently, these people were the people. That is, their views, their take on life and society and politics did define what it meant to be an American. They did define the standards to which others were expected to hew, the default from which others who diverged were anything from odd to abnormal to aberrant. So when somebody pictured a generic American, they tended to picture a somewhat older, upper middle class white male. And it's entirely reasonable to think that those who are now screaming about mask mandates, ivermectin cures, and stop the steal, that when they came to maturity, just like their forebears, they did so thinking of themselves in just that way, that they defined American. But that's been changing for several decades now. The world in which they grew up, the world in which they formed their worldview is disappearing, it's crumbling. And this is not to say, obviously, that racism, sexism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, and the rest no longer exist, but it is to say that the world has changed. It is changing and will continue to change even against resistance. To a significant number of white people, those changes are threats to Hofstadter's causes and types, an existential threat to that established way of life in which they were raised and which formed the core of their worldview, their way of making sense of the world around you. So when people already subjected to social and economic stresses inflicted by forces beyond their control and usually understanding, are faced with the prospect of things becoming even more unhinged in their view, the U.S. becoming a majority-minority nation, well, that just can't be right. And that, plus any bigoted leanings, provide the seeds for a range of conspiracy theories, all of which serve ultimately to deny that this reality could actually be happening legitimately. What all this means is that ultimately, while we often we dismiss the protesters, the shouters, the mask ranters, the stop the steal screechers as some dangerous combination of nutso and racist or fascist. The fact that we have failed to recognize is that a good many of them are genuinely scared. And they just don't even truly understand why or even about or of what. They just know it feels wrong, which is why logical argument is so often unavailing with them. Emotions, by definition, are not logical. So instead of spending as much time as we do in self-satisfying mockery of their foolishness, what we should be doing is considering ways we can address what is almost a social primal fear. Now, on that front, I admit to having no specifics to offer beyond what could be offered in private conversations if you manage to have any with folks across the divide. Other than, for example, remind them of how many social changes we've been through in the last 50 or 100 years. The same sorts of fears that they now express about immigrants are expressed about Chinese, about Irish, about Italians. And how, we managed to get all through that, and we're still here, so certainly we could deal with the changes to come. Or more daringly, if they raise the great replacement notion, note that this past June, an article in The Atlantic argued that considering, among other things, the rising number of multiracial and multi-ethnic households in the U.S., those lines are already becoming blurred to the point where when this majority-minority point is reached, it just won't be that big a deal. Now, let's be clear here. Bigotry is still bigotry, even if driven by economic stress and manipulated fears. Looking for ways to address those stresses and fears does not mean you give them a pass on their bigotry. Doesn't mean you tolerate their behavior. It doesn't mean you condone it or ignore it. It doesn't mean you refrain from calling it out. It means rather that you try to be able to say, in the immortal words of Mr. Spock, I do not approve, I understand. And the truth is, ultimately, I feel sorry for these sorts of folks. First, because some of the changes that are frightening to them, they're not going to be stopped. They can adapt or they can live in fear for the rest of their lives because they won't turn the clock back. They no longer define what it is to be American, and they never will again. Second, because they're almost a sort of Greek tragedy with the doomed hero. They have, again, been manipulated and misled into blaming their troubles on the wrong forces and the wrong people, which means to the very extent that their efforts succeed, to that same extent they will lose and find themselves even deeper in the pit they themselves dug on behalf of the masters that they refuse to recognize. All right, that's it. We're done for now. That's going to be it. I just want to take a moment to thank those people who did say they were looking forward to me coming back. I'm glad to be back. I want to continue this. I hope it will. Any comments or reactions, as always, are appreciated. Just don't expect a quick response because I stink at answering email. But we will see you again. We will see you in 2 weeks. Until then, you have the best 2 weeks you possibly can. And as always, peace.